Hi guys, this is Crew at Psychology. So today I'll be showing you how to write a 9-mark answer for questions in GCSE Psychology, the Edexcel exam board, which will be the same question as the Thai version, but I'm just teaching it in English for those who prefer to watch it in English as well, right? Okay, let me take a second to just share the screen. And it will be the same question as the Thai video as well. So it is the June 2023 question in social influence under Psychology GCSE Edexcel. I'll just show you about how to answer a question on assess social and cultural issues in psychology, which is 9 marks. So psychology students, we need to be aware of the 3 assessment objectives to begin with, that we need to understand the difference between AO1, AO2, and AO3 in addressing each of them to get the full 9 marks. So each assessment objective is 3 marks. We'll need to be discussing all of them in enough detail to get 3 out of 3. But before we start, we need to understand that this is a question in social influence. We need to know what social issue, what cultural issue refers to, as in we don't need to write what it is under AO1, AO2, or AO3, but under this topic, which is in issues and debates in social influence, we need to know that there are different topics under it and what are the topics that come under these issues. So that will be like things like obedience, conformity, bystander effect, or I think there's one more, de-individuation. There we go. But before we decide which one we'll choose to write about, it's very important to read through all of the question. I mean, all words in the question, in this question. Okay, so they give us a scenario. We first begin in the exam in using exam techniques, read the question, then identify the themes that we can possibly write about, and then read the entire question out to ourselves. Maybe quickly underline bits or think about what I should be focusing on. So major atrocities can reveal the most aggressive side of human behavior. Death and destruction during war and the purposeful killing of other humans have been studied in psychology to try to discover the potential causes of these acts. Unearthing the causes of such acts may enable them to be prevented in the future. This is the scenario they gave us, like the main bit that links to war, links to killing, links to aggression. Okay, and then this is the part where they gave us research, or where they mentioned about Milgram, and that there are other research that can help understand things like blind obedience or things that relate to social and cultural issues. So they say Stanley Milgram conducted a series of experiments. Sorry, just wiping something. Okay. To study obedience to authority. Other researchers in psychology have investigated crowd behavior, conformity, and bystander effect. So it's all about research, as I said. Research such as this, so it's an example of one research that they mentioned, has enabled psychologists to understand ways to prevent blind obedience and the social and cultural issues in psychology. Okay, great. So we mainly need to focus on the themes that are under social and cultural issues, which they mentioned Milgram. So students will need to understand that it's about obedience, or at first need to remember that this research falls under the topic of obedience, and then write what it is, write what obedience is. And then, because we know that there are 3 marks in AO1, right? We see like the other topics are in this paragraph here. So they mention things like crowd behavior, which is de-individuation, conformity, bystander effect. We just need 3 of the 4 topics that they listed in here. But conformity and bystander effect are keywords, but crowd behavior, they didn't spell out de-individuation. So I guess I'll stick with obedience, conformity, and bystander effect being 3 words, being the 3 key terms that we'll write about in AO1 to get that 3 mark. So there we go, let's read what I had here. So the definitions of the topics under social and cultural issues in social influence is enough to get 3 out of 3 in AO1. I wrote, obedience is when a person follows orders from an authority figure, and this is the definition of obedience. Is it enough for this to get 1 mark? It actually is, but if you have time in the exam, it will be better to write an example of obedience, which we learned about blind obedience. So anywhere in your answer in the timed condition in the real exam, if you feel you have enough time, if you feel it's like something can be added, it can be explained more clearly, there can be examples, why not put them in, right? Because they help gain marks, or at least they raise our confidence level that we'll definitely get this 1 mark, we'll not miss it. Okay, so I wrote blind obedience as the example of obedience, and then let's continue. Then we had conformity, that it is when a person publicly changes their behavior to fit in with a group of majority. And same, if we can provide an example of conformity, we'll definitely get the mark for conformity as the definition that fits in with social and cultural issue. Okay, so I wrote about compliance being an example of conformity. Then we'll definitely get that 2nd mark, even though this itself, the definition of conformity, might seem enough to get the 2nd mark, right? Then, okay, that's the 2nd mark. The 3rd mark is bystander effect, which is this. And then I say bystander effect is when people choose to not intervene or help those in an emergency situation, which seems good, it's enough. But then, are there any details we can add about bystander effect? There's nothing apart from the factors that causes it, right? Because we didn't learn any examples of bystander effect. I mean, there are none. We just had factors. So I wrote something like, such as due to cost of helping, because we know cost of helping is something that causes bystander effect. People who think there are costs associated with helping, there's something negative that might follow when they intervene in the situation, then they remain as a bystander, and that's bystander effect. So there we go, we had something as a tiny detail that can be added to each of the 3 key terms, and we'll definitely get 3 out of 3 in AO1 here. Okay, so this is perfect. AO1 shouldn't be that difficult. The key term itself is actually enough, but just to be clear, if we add something in it, it'd be better. Then AO2 is about relating the 3 things, the 3 themes or topics that we had. So obedience, conformity, bystander effect, we link these back to the scenario. And as I said, the scenario isn't research, because research will be something in AO3. So this is the scenario about war, about soldiers killing each other, or understanding blind obedience, or something along that line. So if we link these 3 topics in social influence to the scenario about war, then let's look at each. I mean, I only had obedience, but what we need to address is how each of these, so obedience, conformity, and bystander effect, how can these be social issue, or how can these be cultural issue? So it's good to address all of these, and then it's good to cover both social and cultural issues. So I only had an example of obedience in here. So let's see how obedience is a social issue linked to scenario, how obedience is a cultural issue, this paragraph here, linked to scenario. Okay, and then we do this with conformity and bystander effect to address the 3 topics we mentioned in AO1. But let me be clear. So we had both social issue and cultural issue, right? For each of these 3 topics that we had in AO1, so obedience, conformity, and bystander effect, do we need 2 paragraphs on it to talk about social issue in one and cultural issue in the other, like the model answer I had here? No, we only need to pick one. So as in, we write about obedience, we need to pick whether we're gonna consider that to be social issue or cultural issue, and then we do the same for conformity and bystander effect. Pick whether it's social issue or cultural issue. The thing is, we need to cover both social and cultural issue. That's all. That's going to be the 3 marks in AO2. But let's just look at obedience as an example in this video. Okay, so I consider obedience to be a social issue in the first paragraph in AO2 here. And then why is that? So social issue, we need to understand what this is, what social issue is. Social issue, to understand it, it's something that is problematic. It's a problem, it's an issue, right? So it's a problem that occurs in society, something that affects a wide range of people. So referring to the scenario, we know it's about war, we know it's about killing other humans, we know it's about some death happening in in here, right? So that's not good. So it's a problem for society. So I wrote here that obedience can be considered as a social issue, and referring to soldiers in the scenario when soldiers follow destructive orders from an authority figure to kill other humans. So students will have to know what authority figure is, because that's the word, that's the key term associated in the obedience topic under social influence, and then explain which causes harm to society, because it's a social issue. I want to use words like society, social, groups of people to elaborate on how it's a problem. Right, so okay, it causes harm to society, then it's good to sort of like explain a little bit more, because having just one sentence is not enough. Then I'll say why there's more to write here in cultural issue later. So the second sentence elaborating on that is, this can lead to more aggressive behavior produced and further harm to society where innocent people die. Because we're referring to the scenario, so we use words like war, aggressive, human behavior, death or dying. So that's something that actually happens here in this scenario. And we're saying it's a problem because people die. That's something that elaborates on the first sentence to actually get the mark in the second assessment objective here. So that's perfect. But one sentence or too short is not enough. All right. Then cultural issue. As an example for obedience. So obedience can be considered as a cultural issue. We don't need to cover both social and cultural for just obedience. We pick one and do the same for conformity and bystander effect. All right, so obedience can be considered as a cultural issue. If we go along this line, being a cultural issue, we need to explain what it is. So cultural issues in psychology, we know that there are two cultures. There's collectivistic culture and there's individualistic culture. We need to know the difference between them, which is Eastern versus Western culture. And then we know that the collectivist and individualistic culture are different in different ways. So in terms of obedience, there's higher obedience in collectivist culture compared to individualistic culture, and we spot how that's a problem. So when there's more obedience, it means that people are more likely to obey authority figure, people with higher status than us, and it leads to harm, it leads to war, it leads to aggressive behavior and killing of people and people dying, right? So that's how we explain it as a cultural issue and state the culture, which culture it's problematic for. So something like, obedience can be considered as a cultural issue. This is especially seen in collectivist cultures due to this culture, and then we define a little bit about what collectivist culture is, placing emphasis on group membership. So they are more likely to obey authority figures, I guess, and kill others in war. And this is somewhat already good, but we need to like compare it to individualistic culture as well, because there are these two cultures in psychology, right, to address the question, revealing more aggression than individualistic culture. So we're comparing it here, contrasting it here. This is an issue. This is where we get the mark, but we need to write all of this first because the structure is to have the point and then explain on how it's an issue. So this is an issue for collectivist culture, as they are more likely to have blind obedience and not be aware of negative consequences of people dying. So following the orders, the instructions of authority figure, and not being aware, not being thinking of how it's a problem, how killing others are bad. So this is how we write obedience in terms of being a cultural issue. And the same, it depends on whether we choose social or cultural issue. We do that for conformity and bystander effect to get all of the 3 marks in AO2. Okay, so this will be like 3 marks in AO1, 3 marks in AO2. We'll get 6 out of 9 for now. Then the difficult bit will be AO3. So just spot clearly like which bits in the entire question are the scenario. It's not all of this. Not all of this is the scenario. This bit is, this bit isn't. This is just they providing us information so we are more aware of what we need to write about. So AO3 is research, such as Milgram. And I went with Milgram because Milgram is obedience, and It's something that they provided us here. So why not we use Milgram in our answer, right? So I had an example of Milgram being a strength, being a weakness, and then it's quite complicated here in AO3 in this question. And for other questions, it's complicated in different ways. So in terms of strength, we think of the methodology or maybe ethics if it's relevant, but if it's not, then don't use it. But for methodological issues that we learned in research method, we bring them across, we apply them into this research. So it's like evaluating the strength, the weakness of research, or maybe and also in this question, and also saying how that's a social issue, how that's a cultural issue. So some bits are quite repetitive from AO2, but it's not like we're copying information from AO2 into AO3. It's just like we address all of the things that they need to get the mark in AO3. Otherwise, we'll be getting just 6 out of 9. And it had to be a perfect 6 to get 6 out of 9. Otherwise, it would be less. So most students tend to get around that much. And AO3 is having to work on something that we need to practice a lot. So Milgram has useful applications. So we're talking about obedience. If that's something good, then we write that as a strength, usually applications to real life, or we say useful applications or practical applications to raise awareness on negative consequences of obedience. And then it's like we're saying what the research result is, right? So they found that 65% of participants gave maximum voltage, and being specific here that it's 450 voltage, 450 V, and there's high levels of obedience in this research. Okay, so we're writing the results from having a point that it's good in terms of obedience from this research, and then trying to explain at the end how this is good for social issue, how this is good for cultural issue, to address the question on assess these issues in psychology, right? Okay, so for social issue in the strength here, I said it helps researchers understand how obeying negative orders cause social issues, societal problems for those affected in society. I mean, just this is enough. I'm just being very clear on writing the full answer out. And then we know what social issue is. So it's a problem in society. So in order to help that as a useful application, we might be thinking about authority figures and having examples of who are authority figures that can benefit from this research to understand that high level of obedience is not good. So people such as parents, teachers, bosses can reconsider their orders or their instructions to lead to less blind obedience. So people don't follow negative instructions and result in negative outcomes, right? So that's a strength. It helped raise awareness from being the point, writing the result and explaining and linking it back to the question to address either social or cultural or both. But I think one is enough. And then we cover the other one, the other side of the issue here in conformity, in bystander effect, to address both of these together at the end. And all right, the complicated bit is we need both strength and weakness. We need to cover both social and cultural issues. So we need to do both of that. And do we need to write research? I mean, we need to. And some of the 9-mark questions, they don't have research, but this one they do. So I chose this one to teach and let you understand the structure of it. Then Milgram, when we evaluate it in terms of weakness, and by the way, you can see that I chose social issue. I mean, this is both, but okay, it's mainly social and cultural in the one below. So we had an idea to get an idea on how to write if it's for social issue, how to write for both, which is the easiest, and how to write if it's cultural issue. But the main bit is strength and weakness and of research, and covering both social and cultural together with the other examples like conformity and bystander effect. So The Milgram research lacked ecological validity, which is a weakness, and explain why that is, because it's conducted in an artificial setting, be specific where. It's at Yale University. And then put the results and then explain and link that, okay, we need to know what ecological validity is. And if it's a weakness, then it means that it does not represent real life. So research from Milgram is done in not a real life setting. It can't represent real life. So topics on obedience from this research, like destructive obedience, might not be useful or might not be able to explain social and cultural issue. So if it's a strength, it will be able to explain that yes, that is social issue, that is cultural issue. If it's a weakness, it won't be able to explain. So it won't assess social issue, it won't assess cultural issue in psychology because there's something wrong in the research. It cannot represent real life. So in real life, it's going to be different to in Milgram. Then the last one, I want to also talk about cultural issue. So just bear with me here. A weakness. So usually it's easy to think of weaknesses in terms of ecological validity because most research are done in lab, done in artificial setting, and also generalizability. If any research cannot represent the entire population from the definition of generalizability, then it won't be good for that topic, right? It won't assess social, it won't assess cultural issue in psychology. So I wrote here, so students will need to know what generalizability is and that Milgram study lacks generalizability, and we explain it. This is because only 40 male participants were used and all came from New Haven in the USA. And then results here, the same. And then explain further and link that this means that the study only consists of those in individualistic culture. So here you can see I'm talking about cultural issue, saying that it's from individualistic culture and results on, be specific on the topic, destructive obedience, may not represent those, cannot apply to explain those in collectivistic culture. So it means that cultural issues cannot be assessed. This is the link bit to say that it cannot be assessed here as well. If it's a weakness, it cannot be assessed. This it can assess, and it's useful for the strength. So it depends on whether we're writing the strength or the weakness in the 9-mark question. The summary of this is to have AO1, AO2, AO3 in full. Consider 3 points to write in AO1 that can be applied to AO2. So if there are different topics, will that be a problem? It might be. So let's stick with the topics in AO1, applying that across to AO2 and thinking of the research that you can use in AO3. If there are no research, then you'll need to come up with examples and think about how it helps people or how it doesn't. It depends on the question. So this is it for today, and then I hope to see you again in the next clip then. Bye!